and welcome to New Trends in Cyber Incident Response and Forensics, a webinar by LMG Security. My name is Natalie Adams, and I am your moderator for today. Our presenters for the webinar today are Sherri Davidoff and Matt Durring. Sherri Davidoff is the CEO of LMG Security and author of Data Breaches. As a recognized expert in cybersecurity and data breach response, Sherri has been called a, quote, security badass by the New York Times. Her professional experiences are featured in the book Breaking and Entering, the extraordinary story of a hacker called Alien. Sherri is a GIAC certified forensic examiner and penetration tester, receiving her degree in computer science and electrical engineering from MIT. Her next book, Ransomware Response, will be published early next year. Matt Durring is the incident response team lead at LMG Security. He is an instructor at the International Black Hat USA conference where he teaches data breaches. He regularly conducts cybersecurity webinars and seminars for hundreds of attendees in all sectors, including banking, retail, healthcare, government, and more. A seasoned forensics professional, Matt specializes in incident response, ransomware cases, cryptojacking, and banking Trojans. Matt holds a bachelor's degree in computer science from the University of Montana and previously worked as a blue team field technician and system administrator for over 10 years. His malware research was recently featured on NBC Nightly News. Sherri, at this time, I'm passing you control of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I'm glad you could join us today for New Trends in Cyber Incident Response and Forensics. A lot has changed, even just in the past year with people working remotely, hackers starting to use new tactics, and certainly having access to ever-increasing pools of funding. So today we're going to talk about some of the latest developments. Matt, I know just within the past couple of days, there was news that the REvil ransomware gang had hit a nuclear weapons contractor. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, Sol Orions was affected in the end of May by a ransomware incident in a couple of their facilities. It was announced just a couple of days ago that there was data actually exfiltrated, although they say that no top secret data was plundered.
Well, and that actually touches on two trends that we're seeing. So first of all, hackers are targeting suppliers and pieces of our critical infrastructure, and that is affecting everybody. You know, when our gas supply is interrupted, it affects all organizations. And then second, we are seeing ransomware operators really very effectively stealing data before they lock it up. And that means that by the time you detect ransomware, they've probably been in your system for quite some time, and there's a very good chance that data has been taken as well. So today we're going to start off by talking about supply chain incidents and tips and tricks for how to handle them, how you handle mass zero-day exploits such as the recent Exchange vulnerability and what it means for all of us, how we need to update our response processes. We're going to dig into a case study that Matt put together about how to manage remote worker compromises, something that's becoming increasingly important. And finally, along the way, we'll talk about how we all need to be integrating threat hunting into our response operations, one of the biggest developments from the past couple of years. JBS, of course, is an international food supplier, and they were attacked within the past month. Their operations were taken down. They had 9 beef plants shut down entirely, and so this absolutely impacted the supply chain. It turned out that after the fact, we discovered that they paid $11 million in ransom. And again, this is part of a trend. So we're starting to see a significant increase in ransomware attacks. This is a trend that has started probably, I think, 2016, Matt, and has just been increasing exponentially over time. And now that the hackers are pulling in multi-million-dollar payments, they are able to reinvest those back into their own technology and their own infrastructure, which is making them more effective and then perpetuating the cycle. So I think during our last webinar, we talked about how we've seen a cybercrime industrial revolution, and that is absolutely a continuing trend. And insurers are starting to step back. So we're seeing insurance companies finally taking some significant losses due to ransomware. In fact, ransomware accounted for 41% of all cyber insurance claims. So Matt and I, of course, study ransomware. We love to talk about it on a regular basis. Our book is on ransomware, but it's not just because we're interested in it. It's because it is really the #1 threat out there today. The standalone cybersecurity losses have just increased, and you can see that they're up 41%. So what does that mean? Well, they're hiking rates. For those of you that are in the process of renewing your policies, you've probably found that either they're pushing back and requiring you to have multi-factor authentication, which is very important, or you may simply see rate increases or reductions in coverage, stronger limits. So be aware of how your cyber insurance policy is changing and how that may affect your risk management and also how you respond. All right, so Matt, why don't you tell us about the Colonial pipeline attack? We're going to use this as a case study for supply chain attacks, and then talk about some of the trends we're seeing with ransomware criminals.
Yeah, thanks, Sherri. And as you mentioned, this is a great example of how the ransomware kind of environment has risen to this now almost country disrupting form of cyber attacks. Colonial Pipeline is a great example of that. On May 7th. Of this year, Colonial Pipeline was taken completely offline by a ransomware attack that actually ended up causing major gas shortages throughout most of the east coast of the United States. This was a big deal, and it caused things like panic buying, and it caused an increase in gas prices, and really kind of caught the attention of the nation, seeing that these attacks can really have a significant impact on it.
Yeah, I think caught the attention is an understatement.
Yeah, right. So who were the hackers in this case? Well, it turned out the hacker group behind the Colonial Pipeline attack was a group called Darkside. And Darkside is a ransomware as a service operator. They create ransomware software and then basically lease the ability to use the software out to a series of affiliates that work underneath them, conduct the attacks, and then pay them a portion of it. Since Darkside's introduction in late fall of 2020, they've managed to rake in over $90 million in ransom payments, with an average payment per victim of right about $1.9 million. So this has been a very, very profitable criminal industry, and really underscores how this can be such a rising trend in the cybersecurity landscape. Why this is such a big problem for us right now. So as we mentioned, hacker groups like Darkside are a great example of a new model we see called a franchise model, where ransomware operators are bringing in smaller cybercrime groups or affiliate cybercrime groups and creating these kind of intricate networks of criminals that all kind of work together, utilize the same infrastructure and hardware and software, and share the profits because of it. Because they're operating this way, they can affect a lot more people and have a much broader reach in the actual attacks they're able to carry out. This isn't kids sitting in someone's basement anymore, hitting one computer at a time. They're taking down full enterprises with these attacks.
Yeah, unfortunately for the criminals, it's a win-win, both for the operators of the network and also for the affiliates that are using it. It's made ransomware accessible to our less technical criminal organizations. And in this slide, you can see another growing trend is point-and-click ransomware. So this is, I think this was the Ninja Rat, correct, Matt?
Correct.
That we grabbed from the dark web, and literally you just point, click, encrypt, and it locks up all of your files. And this is just one example of many, many options for ransomware that you can purchase on the dark web.
It really is. And this goes along with another trend that we're seeing as far as attacks against networks go, or cyber attacks in general. Previously, you might think of cyber attacks as utilizing very sophisticated zero-day attacks or custom hacking software. We're really seeing a shift away from that. Hackers are really using commercial-grade software to conduct their attacks at this point. What you see in front of you is a list out of the Darkside Ransomware Group's methodology, which actually applies very well to several other ransomware operators out there, or cyber criminal groups in general. And the tools that they're using are actually professional pen testing and network administration toolkits. So we have things like the Cobalt Strike toolkit being used. That is being used to establish persistence, to drop what are called beacons on networks, which allow for continued access and lateral movement. They're using tools like Advanced IP Scanner to map out networks, and they're using things like PS Exec to push software out the same way that a network administrator would do, except in this case, it's ransomware and not, an update to Microsoft Word.
So here's another example of Cobalt Strike in use. And on Dark Reading, we saw a nice article that detailed these tools. They found that nearly 60% of PowerShell exploits are employing Cobalt Strike, and then 12% are employing Cobalt Strike and Microsoft Windows tools that Matt just described. So again, this is a trend. It allows them to blend. It allows them to take advantage of all the development that's being done in the legitimate commercial software world and then apply that to cybercrime. And the attackers, nice picture, Matt. The attackers are lurking in your systems. And we've seen different statistics on this. I believe this is from Sophos, correct, Matt?
That's correct, yeah.
This is a report just from this month. They found that in a ransomware attack, the attackers were lurking in your system for about 11 days. That's the median dwell time, and it can be shorter than that. It absolutely can be longer than that. We actually frequently see cases where they're lurking for weeks or months or sometimes even longer. And 69% of the time, they're using RDP for lateral movement within the organization. So again, it's not some fancy backdoor. It's the same tools that legitimate system administrators are using, and that helps them in that it's not setting off all the alerts.
So as the attackers are in your network, it turns out that, based on Sophos research anyway, they're spending a lot of time gaining that initial foothold. And this is why proactive threat hunting becomes really, really important. We'll talk about that a little bit farther down in the webinar. But 64% of the time that the attackers spend in your network is on initial access, execution, and persistence, a vast majority of this time. And then privilege escalation, defense evasion, credential access, this is all them basically gearing up to execute an attack against you. Really what it comes down to is 80% of the time, they're just getting ready. They're trying to get themselves into a position to attack. So with a proactive search strategy, if we can catch them in this 80% of the time they're in your network, we can really minimize any further damage that they might be able to do.
You know, we always say as defenders, win first, then do battle, to paraphrase Sun Tzu, where if you spend all that time planning, then you will be successful. And unfortunately, it looks like that's what the criminals are doing too, huh?
Absolutely. The other 20% of the time is discovery, movement, and then hitting you with ransomware. Again, this is a very short amount of the overall time period they're in your network. So we want to make sure that we're emphasizing accurate monitoring, logging, alerting, making sure we catch them in that beginning 80% so we don't end up with a ransomware attack on our hands in the first place.
So what can we do about it, Matt?
Well, threat hunting. Threat hunting has become kind of a new arsenal, or a new tool in the cybersecurity professionals' arsenal over the last couple of years. Previously, this was just kind of a buzzword, but it's really taken a high profile in the industry as a very, very valuable service. This is a proactive, human-driven approach to network security. When we do threat hunting engagements with LMG, we'll utilize specialized tools to search for really, really subtle indicators of compromise on a network. These are things that traditional antivirus software would probably miss. So we're looking for strange behavior, not necessarily the signs of a malicious piece of software on the network. We use this to find and eradicate persistent threats, things that might have been in your network for a while. Because remember, the attacker who deploys ransomware in your network in the end is likely not the attacker who originally compromised you. There's a lot of access trading that happens in cyber criminal groups. So if we can catch that initial access point, we can cut off the ability to execute software later down the road, like ransomware attacks.
So what happened in Colonial Pipeline? Well, it's interesting, and our Breaking Breaches this month is on Colonial Pipeline. So if you want to have the full scoop on it, do tune into our YouTube channel at LMG and check out Breaking Breaches. But to give you a quick summary, it turns out that they paid the ransom. They actually paid it and apparently didn't tell the media. The media was reporting that it hadn't been paid for several days. And then we find out that they had paid almost $5 million. Did that do them any good, Matt?
Not really. As it turns out, the decryption software that was offered by the Darkside ransomware group was so slow that it really would not help them get their network back up and going any faster than they could with just their regular backups.
Yeah, we are seeing, though, these multi-million-dollar payouts. Now, in this case, it turns out that the criminal gang that they're working with, the Darkside ransomware gang, have morals, ? On their website, the Darkside website, they say that they will not attack hospitals or funeral services or education, schools, universities, you name it. So that's interesting to see that they have some ethical concerns. And that came up after the attack. You might think, okay, well, if they're attacking a pipeline, they're going to impact all of those organizations and more. And it turns out that apparently it wasn't intentional. The Darkside group came out and said, our goal is to make money, not create problems for society. And from today, we're introducing moderation, and we're going to check each company that our partners want to encrypt to avoid social consequences. So I kind of wonder, is this a reaction because at that point, law enforcement and everyone else in the world was after them, or is this something that they're truly concerned about? Hard to say. Regardless, it did not go well for Darkside. Fill us in, Matt.
So Darkside basically had to quit operation. Their Bitcoin stash was seized. A lot of their servers were taken offline. A lot of their critical infrastructure was taken down by the FBI, which is an interesting kind of turn of fate for them. But yeah, Darkside kind of just disappeared off into the sunset, or attempted to anyway. But they made a very, very crucial mistake. They actually forgot to pay their affiliates for the work that had already been done, which led to another really interesting development from this story.
And this isn't the first time we've seen the criminals overreaching, right?
Oh, that's correct. The screenshots you see in front of you are from the Babbage ransomware. This is from a few months ago, but Babbage ransomware was responsible for infecting the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. And this, again, became a very, very highly scrutinized ransomware attack. The Babbage ransomware crew was actually criticized by other ransomware operators for going after a target like this, mainly because they went for data exposure extortion against the police department, threatening to release things like officers' psychiatric evaluations or the names of confidential informants, which obviously means that there were real life and death consequences to this data potentially being leaked. Very devastating attack. Babbage is another one of the groups that, after pressure from other governments, has since ceased operations.
Yep, and it's interesting, you can see at the bottom of the screen, we've never attacked hospitals, orphanages, nursing homes, charitable foundations. So if this sounds similar, these are really trends. The criminals overreaching, the criminals saying that they're not going to attack hospitals, even though sometimes they do, and then law enforcement, in some cases, coming back to deal with these higher profile entities. In this case, it wasn't just law enforcement, though, was it? It was also the hackers themselves that followed up with Darkside.
That's correct. Darkside ended up in hacker court, which is apparently a real thing. We've recently discovered. Yeah, it was really interesting. The partners demanded their share of the ransoms. They wanted to get paid for the work they had done, and their recourse was to take them into a court system that was set up within the ransomware communication network and the forums that were used to actually connect affiliates with these ransomware operators. The People's Court. I love it. This was from the xss.is forums. This is a Russian ransomware forum. And here's some rules that they actually have in place for guaranteeing that affiliates do get paid by overarching ransomware operators. They require a large deposit that can be utilized in the case that payments are not being made correctly. They can basically have an arbitrator step in, decide if someone should be paid, and make the payment for them. And they're looking at, of course, this is all in cryptocurrency. None of this is in regular cash. So we're talking about things like likely Monero in this case, because it's an anonymous currency. But yeah, the withdrawal fee is 4%. Commissions transferring to another user is 0%. So there's no penalty for paying your people. But they want to make sure that these obligations are actually being honored. So again, very interesting that there is at least some honor among thieves. And this is a screenshot of one of the arbitration hearings that we saw. It was a forum where people could come and they could stake their claim against Darkside and claim that they needed to be paid. The arbitrator would go through, evaluate the evidence, and then either confirm or deny the claim. Those that were confirmed were actually paid for their services. So again, very interesting.
It's just fascinating to me. It's not like they could go to a normal court and get recourse. So exactly. It makes sense that this is developing, but I think it's fascinating that they actually were holding enough money to pay some of these claims. But it turns out a lot of that money was seized.
Yeah, so this is a very rare occurrence that we get to see in ransomware cases. The FBI was actually able to recover 63.7 of the 75 Bitcoin that Colonial Pipeline paid to Darkside as the ransom for their network. Now, the original ransom amount was right about $5 million, just a little bit under. The recovered amount of Bitcoin, even though it was very close to the same number of Bitcoin, was actually worth less at that point because the value had dropped. So about $2.3 million was recovered. What was interesting, though, is the Bitcoin was recovered from a cryptocurrency exchange somewhere in Northern California. We don't know exactly which one, but the thought at this point, which has not yet been confirmed, is that keys to this cryptocurrency wallet were actually confiscated in a raid by another law enforcement agency in another country, and then were provided to the FBI to get them access to this wallet, which was an interesting kind of cooperational effort, if it's true. It might not be, but.
Yeah, so again, this is a trend where we see law enforcement intervention. I don't think I've ever seen so many busts as we've seen this year, right, Matt? I mean, wasn't there just another one like this morning or yesterday?
Yeah, the Clop ransomware crew just this morning was taken offline by Ukrainian police, and we'll bring that up in our next presentation. But great video and screenshots of them being taken out of the building and all their cash being seized. It's beautiful.
It's amazing. NetWalker, Emotet, Clop, so many others. And then they're also intervening, I guess, to protect private companies. This is a huge trend that's a little bit scary. So when several months ago, when we found out that Microsoft Exchange servers had a 0-day vulnerability, of course, in a lot of cases, organizations had already been hacked. Criminals around the world had already started exploiting it, installing their software, and law enforcement intervened to help quickly respond. I know, Matt, can you fill us in a little more? I know it was a judge in Texas that made the decision allowing law enforcement to do this.
Yeah, it was a single judge in Texas that basically granted unilateral access to the FBI to enter servers that they were able to identify that contain these vulnerabilities, clean these malicious web shells out of the server, and then basically lock the server back out when they left. Now, the FBI was required to notify anyone who they performed this action on within, I believe it was 30 days of taking this effect. So it's that they weren't doing it like secretly behind the scenes, I guess, in total. But at the time that it actually happened, these remediation efforts took place before there was any kind of public announcement for it. So it was a surprise to a lot of researchers.
Yeah, I mean, for responders, it's not just researchers. For responders, it's also concerning that anyone might be gaining access to production systems because you could cause instability. You could, if there's software being installed, that could potentially have consequences that no one is aware of. Obviously, this hadn't really been tested on those systems before. So think about how your organization feels about law enforcement access to your servers, how you intend to respond to it, and just be aware that it may happen. And that's definitely a trend that we're seeing. And in response to the Capitol Pipeline incident, we have been seeing a lot of attention from government and from representatives. So there's been a lot of talk about banning ransomware payments. Obviously, the thought is that that would help to stop the tide of funding to these criminals. And so here you can see the Energy Secretary in the United States came out and said that she would support that. The problem, of course, is that the United States is not alone in the world with dealing with a ransomware problem. There's many other countries around the world where ransomware criminals get paid. And we've also seen criminals themselves coming back and saying that it wouldn't be a deterrent for them. I suspect we'd also see some ransom payments under the table, which could really put organizations in jeopardy, because a lot of times we may not have an option other than trying to buy a decryptor in order to get money back. So more recently, the U.S. has come out and said that they're going to be treating ransomware like terrorism. Matt, do you want to speak to this a little bit?
Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of shift in policy. The government obviously is not pro ransomware in any way, shape, or form, but in most cases, when we're talking about ransomware operators, or at least over the last couple of years, most of their advice has just been simply to gather evidence and to basically do their due diligence, advise people not to pay. But there wasn't a lot of elevated interest in this. Recently, that has changed, obviously, because now critical infrastructure is being affected by this, but it comes with its own set of pitfalls. There's quotes or concerns about painting something like ransomware with as broad of a brush as calling it all terrorism. The quote on the screen in front of you says it perfectly. If a small ransomware operator attacks a dental office, that's not really an act of terrorism. But if they take down critical infrastructure, it is. So there's some nuance there that needs to be sorted out. I do think it's a good move to start treating this, though, as a higher priority from a governmental level. But we'll see where we end up with that.
Yeah, and here you can see the criminals are saying they're undeterred. So this is from the REvil ransomware gang. They follow developments in legislation, and the gang came out and said if ransomware victims were restricted from paying, it would not be a deterrent for future attacks. And if they end up taking down an organization, I don't think they're crying about that. So we've seen lawmakers walking this back a little bit and instead saying that ransom payments should be disclosed. And I think there's a real chance that this could happen, that we may see a requirement for disclosing ransom payments, similar to the wall of shame, in healthcare, where we see a requirement to disclose data breaches. And it's interesting that we're not seeing that that strong proactive measure, at least not as strong as I would, as I think would be most effective. But simply having to make it public can certainly be a deterrent and help organizations invest more.
This has also led to some interesting new oversight bodies being created by the government. So two of them have been created lately. The first one is the Ransomware and Digital Extortion Task Force, which is a Department of Justice wing. The Ransomware and Digital Extortion Task Force has been behind a lot of the ransomware interventions that we've seen over the last couple of months. They're still a very new agency, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what their responsibilities are in terms of the broad cybersecurity scope. But it's a great step forward. There's also a piece of the new Biden policy that is establishing a cyber safety review board. Think about this like the NTSB, or the Transportation and Safety Board, but for cybersecurity. It's going to be a combination of public and private industry that will be able to come together and basically perform postmortems on large-scale cyber attacks and kind of dictate where policy should potentially go from there. Really, really interesting.
And then we have the new executive order. So the new executive order has some specific changes that will absolutely affect our response processes. And again, our topic today is about incident response. All of this legislation will affect how we need to respond to incidents. If there is a risk that your ransom payment may get publicly disclosed, that's something that's important to include in our calculations. So in particular, the executive order applies to suppliers, and it kind of was motivated by the SolarWinds supply chain attacks. The purpose is to create more visibility in supply chain security, particularly technology supply chain. It applies to suppliers of the government, but we are absolutely going to see some of these requirements trickling down to the private sector because, of course, many suppliers do business with the public and private sector. So let's take a look at some of the requirements. First of all, the goal is to improve the software supply chain security and increase information sharing capabilities. Some of the things that are noteworthy in there are requirements for suppliers to have better capabilities to track and detect incidents. So, and also to share those incidents with affected agencies. Right now, if there's a cloud provider that you're doing business with, for example, and they're hit with a ransomware incident, you may or may not be able to get evidence from them that can help you investigate whether your data had been stolen. And so this is going to really push cloud providers and other software providers to include capabilities for telling victims if their data has been leaked and to provide evidence to them. We're also going to see stronger cybersecurity incidents for everyone in the supply chain. So again, in the case of SolarWinds, there had been a backdoor installed in their software for months and months before anybody detected it. So, and often organizations have limited ability to vet these suppliers. So this will help to increase standards. They're going to have default contractual requirements. So follow this and think about it, because if the government is creating standards for contractual obligations for suppliers, again, that's something that we're likely going to see in the private industry as well. And that might include standard notification times, standard definitions of breaches or incidents that need to be disclosed to customers. Right now, if Microsoft gets hacked, when Microsoft has been hacked in the past, they're not necessarily required to disclose that to customers. There have been cases where years later we find out that hackers had access to source code or other key intellectual property, and that affects the risk of everybody in the supply chain. And then they're going to improve supplier detection capabilities and formalize those response processes. So these are all really great steps forward. One of the ones I'm most excited about, though, is the SBOM. So this is the software bill of materials that is being required. And I think this is just such a brilliant idea, Matt, where the government is going to require suppliers to provide kind of a list of ingredients, a bill of materials, so that you know what other software they rely on. And that is super important because often there is a vulnerability, not in your third-party supplier software, but in a fourth-party or a fifth-party supplier software that they are in fact relying on. And right now, there's actually no way for most of us to tell what our risk level is or to track it, because that information is not transparent. We don't know exactly what our suppliers rely on. And this would change that, where suppliers would then give you an SBOM, the bill of materials, and you would be able to evaluate that. One of the ways this will change our response is that if a vulnerability is announced in a piece of software, your response team can check and see if it applies to you. So we'll want to track that and monitor it on a regular basis. I actually think in another couple of years, checking your risk due to software vulnerabilities is going to be very different for all of us because of this.
You know, I think the inclusion of the vulnerability disclosure program and the sharing that's going to come about from that will be really beneficial to the response and security industries just in general. Knowing if there's a tiny little vulnerability that someone revealed that can then be shared with everyone who uses that product effectively. Will, I think, cause or will keep a lot of bad things from happening. Think about something like Pulse VPN. Those vulnerabilities have been around for a really long time, but they're not very well publicized, and people are still getting hit with attacks based on those.
Wow. Yeah, that's true. We even saw one this week. Okay, tell us about SolarWinds. What? Isn't this like 6 months ago?
Yeah,
Come on,
speaking of SolarWinds, they're back in the news. It turns out the SVR, the group that was responsible for the SolarWinds hack in the first place, or at least was attributed as being responsible for it, is back at it again. The state-backed Russian group has been kind of revealed to be behind a mass campaign of attempted compromise going after a bunch of new government organizations. And they're really going after things like think tanks, consulting agencies, government contractors, basically trying to reestablish that access that they lost when SolarWinds went offline. So again, we'll want to see how this develops as we move forward. But again, it's the same high-profile, highly funded, very talented Russian cybercrime group going after basically the same targets.
So tell us more about SolarWinds.
So SolarWinds, if you watched our Breaking Breaches on this or have seen any of our webinars recently, was really a kind of a turning point for supply chain compromise because it affected a lot of people around the country. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of users of this software that were reported anyway to have been potentially exposed by this. And hackers had managed to have a backdoor in the SolarWinds software for months and months and months. They were able to gain access to highly confidential networks, steal very critical data, control those networks, potentially install new backdoors. I mean, the sky was kind of the limit as to what the capabilities were, but it really showcased a deficiency in supply chain management that needed to be addressed. Obviously, the government has stepped in at this point and is attempting to make some changes to it. But it has really caused a shift in how we view supply chain compromise, how we respond to it, how we look for signs of compromise. I think a lot of organizations are no longer treating these trusted vendors, pieces of software and hardware as trusted. They're moving more towards that zero trust model where everything gets scanned by antivirus, everything is under scrutiny, and that's really the way to go when it comes to detecting and then responding to these situations.
So the bottom line is that we need to update our response processes and stay tuned over the next year when there's new legislation or new developments in capabilities. Make sure that you're aware of that, particularly if ransomware payments are going to be disclosed or we're going to need to be checking for vulnerabilities. That's something to be aware of. Make sure you're including suppliers and contractors in your response processes. That's something that came out of the NIST cybersecurity framework updates a few years ago. And I think it's a really good idea. You obviously can't include all of them, but you can certainly prioritize and include your key suppliers. Also, check your cloud logs and make sure you have them. Make sure that you have the evidence you're looking for. Don't expect that suppliers will just give it to you if an incident happens. And again, I would focus on those priority suppliers where if you're keeping any kind of regulated or sensitive data in a cloud repository, that's the one to check and make sure that you actually have evidence for. Prepare for law enforcement involvement. And remember, they may access your servers without telling you ahead of time, apparently 30 days after they needed to let you know. But still, you could have some unexpected interaction. Understand your insurance coverage and understand that it will probably change over the next couple of years. So you're going to want to be prepared for that so you're not taken by surprise. And finally, make sure you're including remote workers and contractors as you evaluate your response processes. Speaking of which, over the past year and a half, we've seen a huge exodus of workers from the physical office. And while in some cases people are coming back, most of them are not, things are not going to be exactly the way they were. We already have a lot of remote workers, and that is a trend that will continue. So it's caused some challenges and hiccups for incident response. How do you detect incidents and how do you respond to incidents when it's an employee working from home on a laptop that they own? So today we're going to hear about a case, a real case with a professional services firm that got hacked. And Matt's going to walk you through the investigation. He was actually the lead that managed it. And we'll talk about how response processes have changed and adapted over the past year. So Matt, take it away.
Great, thank you. So yeah, this is a professional services firm that we worked with right near the very beginning months of the pandemic when everyone was rushing to work from home. About 50 full-time employees worked for this organization, but they had about 300 independent contractors that worked remotely in the organization. They were coming in via VPN connections. And the company did have a policy against using personal devices for work use on the network, but as is unfortunately the case in a lot of SMBs, those policies are not very effectively enforced. There's a lot of people that utilize their own public devices on company networks, and eventually it just kind of becomes the norm. People do it without thinking about the potential consequences behind it. So what happened here? Well, you could probably guess, but ransomware struck. Monday morning at about 2 o'clock, we were able to figure out that ransomware was detonated against the network. Web servers were down, databases were down, their production systems were all offline. I mean, this was bad. The company was pretty much at a standstill because they didn't have any of their network. There were ransom notes on all of the screens of the affected computers inside the network, and the attackers took it a step further and did what's called print bombing. They actually sent printer scripts out to all of the connected printers in the office and printed ransom notes until they ran out of paper. So there were literally thousands of copies of these ransom notes sitting on every printer in the environment. There was no missing that this was a ransomware incident. Also, the VPN went down. People couldn't actually get back in to do any of their work, so they were effectively dead in the water at that point. No business happening.
Well, I know if they had 300 people, like the majority of their team around the world working remotely, this must have been completely devastating for their normal operations, correct?
Oh yeah, it really was. This was a major issue for them. So we had to look through first and figure out what was gone, like what was the actual impact of this incident. We figured out after investigation that the primary data servers were fully encrypted. Backups were fully encrypted too, so they were not recoverable. They couldn't come back from the backups that they had. They couldn't do any kind of data recovery to get any data back out of those. They were completely offline. And their operational data was also unrecoverable at this point. So their financial data, employee records, vendor data, intellectual property, all of it was basically dust at this point. So you can tell the kind of serious scenario this company found themselves in. They really needed help getting the response kicked off on this one, and we needed to do it quickly. We had days, not weeks, to bring this network back up from the event that they'd just undertaken. Otherwise, they were flat out going to go out of business. There was going to be no hope for them at that point.
So they weren't just saying, pay us and you'll get your data back. They were also saying, pay us or we're going to leak your data to the world. And this included their core intellectual property. This is known as a double extortion ransomware attack, and it has been a very effective way for criminals to get money, to get people to pay the ransom. Criminals have realized people have backups. They're still pretty good at deleting backups in a lot of cases, but it just kind of puts a lot of extra pressure on when they're also threatening to leak it, and you have to worry about a breach investigation and fines and things like that. As a result, today, 77% of ransomware cases involve data theft. Your data is also valuable. They could sell it to a competitor. They could make money off of it in other ways. Check out our dark web talk if you want to see other examples of data for sale on the dark web. So in this case, the ransom demand was $1.2 million in Bitcoin. And we're starting to see more and more multi-million-dollar demands, even just within the past couple of months. These days, we're seeing a new trend, triple extortion. This has been in the news a lot lately, ever since Apple was targeted in a $50 million ransomware attack. So one of their suppliers, Quanta, was hacked and got schematics that pertain to Apple devices, and then the gangs threatened to leak Apple's information onto the dark web. So they're not just targeting the victim and asking for payment from the victim, they're also targeting the victim's customers and vendors and patients and anyone else who's part of their community. So this has been all over the headlines, triple extortion threat, but it's not actually new. For example, in 2016, we saw the dark overlord taking over many organizations, and they were not as turnkey as we see modern ransomware gangs, but once they got into a network, they were very scary. So they started taking over schools around the country. One of them in Johnston, Iowa, they took over, and then they started calling parents and texting them and messaging students saying that they had taken over the cameras because they had people's contact information. And they leveraged that in order to get the victims to put pressure on the schools to pay. More recently, we've seen the REvil ransomware gang threatening to leak client data to the world, and it sounds like they have targeted the clients themselves when they've hacked into law firms. So here you can see the ransomware gang hacked the law firm to the stars in New York, demanded $42 million, or they would leak dirt on Donald Trump. And if I recall correctly, Matt, somebody bought it. At least that's what REvil said. Somebody paid them $42 million.
Yeah, somebody paid over $40 million for this data. We still don't know who it was, but someone got it.
And they leaked Lady Gaga's information. So again, the triple extortion threat is not a new thing, but it's becoming such a common trend that we're starting to see all these cool buzzwords. And I think that's because it's hitting the headlines, it's hitting the news. I mean, a lot of these concepts aren't new, but now that they're in the headlines, they have cool names like the Heartbleed vulnerability. Okay, so at this point, our organization is down, they're dead in the water, they've been taken over. Who do you call? Well, IT is of course going to be involved to help the recovery process, and you may need to call in outside IT because at this point there's a lot going on. There may be an investigation, they're trying to recover, they're trying to respond to employees that are down. You also have the insurer involved potentially. You may have outside attorneys, you have a forensics and response firm. This is what we think we look like. This is what we actually look like. That's you, Matt. All right, so this is LMG's incident response roadmap. And once the incident is detected, we go into triage and evidence preservation mode. So triage is where we prioritize the next steps. Again, you have a ton going on. You have limited resources. What do you do next? What are your core systems? You can't bring everything up at once. What is your key information at risk? And then you can decide how you want to eradicate the threat and come up with your game plan. Now, a lot of times people are really focused on recovering. Oh my gosh, let's format and reinstall, get rid of the malware, get back up and running. And then you find out there may have been a data breach or that information actually gets leaked on the dark web and there's a lot of attention and you have no way of telling what was actually stolen and what wasn't. So it's really important to consider the risk of a data breach very early on in this process and take a moment to preserve evidence before you move on. You need evidence in order to rule out a breach. In a lot of cases, and I am not a lawyer, but a lot of the times, if you don't have evidence, you're not able to rule out a breach and you end up having to notify everybody whose data was on the system. Whereas if you have evidence about what was accessed and what wasn't, your notification can be a lot smaller, it will be a lot more expensive, it will be a lot less damaging. So I like to think of evidence as a turkey. If you leave it out, it's going to spoil. Instead, make sure that you freeze it. You take a moment to preserve it before you move on and start restoring computers. Here's some common evidence preservation mistakes. I'd say first and foremost, often evidence gets destroyed during the recovery process in ransomware cases, where either we don't think to restore the logs or people just want to get right back to work and wipe it and reinstall. Also, sometimes we try to preserve evidence too late. We have had an email hacking case recently where IT responded to the email hacking case. They spent about two and a half months investigating. Eventually, it was transitioned over to us. But by the time we got involved in the case, there was about a week of information missing because those logs rolled over after 90 days. And that meant that we weren't able to conclusively prove that the criminals hadn't accessed certain information in the email accounts. So you can't go back in time and restore data that's been deleted. Instead, it's important to just get it right away. Also, curiosity. We had an intellectual property theft case where someone took the computer and started opening files to see what was on it. And each of those files has a last access time that can tell you if a hacker or a malicious insider had actually accessed that information, potentially given the context. When you open a file, you erase that last access time and you've lost that information. So those are just a few ways that we see evidence getting destroyed. All right, once you have preserved evidence, actually at the same time, you're going to be doing rapid containment. You want to stop the bleeding, make sure that the data is not continuing to go out the door, make sure that you've halted encryption. Matt, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you contained this case?
Yeah, in this case, we basically had to contain it by freezing the network in place. So we killed all remote sessions that were active inside the network. We immediately reset every user password on the system. We wanted to just block anything that was still connected from getting in. We also fully disconnected their VPN system. Even though their contractors were not able to access using VPN, the system itself was still online. So we didn't want to leave anything potentially open. We also disconnected their primary servers from the network. We didn't want any lateral movement into those servers to be possible. And then we were able to turn around and establish a very, very limited scope remote access just for our team. So we were able to access the network from a whitelisted IP address, but nobody else was able to get in. That's when we were actually able to start responding to the case.
Okay, so once you have it contained, you've stopped the bleeding, it's time to develop your investigative strategy. What's your plan for the rest of it? And in order to help do that, it can be helpful to work backwards and figure out how it started. What did you end up finding in this case?
Yeah, so running through the data that we had from the case through our initial investigation, we were able to determine that the ransomware was detonated at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Monday. The ransomware executables themselves had been pushed from the domain controller using the PSExec toolkit. So again, this is something that an IT person would do if they were installing software on a network. In this case, it was being used for malicious purposes. We also found that there was a remote desktop session connected to the domain controller at this time using a service account from the network. So now we know the time that the attack happened, we know how it happened, and we know the service account that was potentially compromised to make it happen. Using those, we can now move forward into our threat hunting and use those as kind of our base points.
So threat hunting has become increasingly important in these cases. If you don't fully eradicate the threat, you will get reinfected. The criminals are often happy to charge more the second time around because they had to do more work. So tell us what you found here, Matt.
So based on the ransomware strain, we knew the adversary in this case was going to be the eGregor ransomware group. They were kind of an offshoot of the Maze ransomware group, so we knew they were pretty serious. We'd actually just come off of another case with Maze where another organization had been responding to them, and the Maze ransomware group had been taunting that response group because they weren't able to get them out of the network quickly enough. So we were very cognizant of that. What we were looking for in this case were commercial toolkits. Basically, we were looking for Cobalt Strike and the presence of those beacons we talked about a little bit earlier. We were also looking for ransomware executables both inside and outside of the network a little bit later. Malicious network traffic, and then encoded PowerShell. These were some really telltale signs. And we used Carbon Black to do this piece of the threat hunting in particular. So with Carbon Black, we were actually able to granularly look at the network and see when these very specific kind of commands were running. You can see an example of it right here. PowerShell is executing a command that has been base 64 encoded, so the actual commands are not readable to the human eye. Running this through our software, we can decode this and figure out what it's actually doing. But this is kind of at this point, this was a telltale sign of malicious activity. It didn't stay that way, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. We were also looking for malicious network traffic. So we were looking for any hosts on the system that were attempting to communicate outbound to a host that was flagged as either in a high profile cybercrime area or something that was just not basically in line with normal network communications. And again, we're looking at the systems themselves doing this. And these aren't pieces of software that can be picked up using antivirus software. Which is what makes threat hunting so important in cases like this. This is the behavior of the system. A lot of times these are hollowed out processes or benign custom applications that will not get picked up on a virus scan, but are actually malicious in their intent.
Okay, so what about the remote workers in this case? They weren't connected to the VPN yet,
That's correct.
But they had some infected systems, right, Matt?
Yeah, there was widespread infection on a lot of the remote workers, and so we didn't want to just allow them back into the network to reinfect everything. We basically had to come up with a plan to get them back online, but get them back online in a way that we had visibility into their systems and could stop anything bad from happening. We also had an issue because these contractors the company was implementing were all over the world. Some of them were in Russia, some were in China, some were in India. So these are geolocations that in a cyber attack we might block to prevent malicious activity from happening. In this case, we did not have that option. We also had no control over their personal systems. Again, these were people's laptops in other countries that had no security software on them whatsoever. So kind of a tenuous part of the response at this point.
Yeah, what'd you do?
Well,
what is that picture?
We saved their bacon. That's what that picture is supposed to be.
So bad.
We dropped in our centrally managed defense software. This is our Carbon Black toolkit. We put it on both corporate and personal devices if used. We actually had an agreement with the organization that anyone that came back onto the network needed to have Carbon Black installed on their computer. We needed to be able to scan the computer before it hit the network, and we needed full visibility into everything that was happening there. And because of this, we were able to stop those malicious activities before they rejoined the network and sanitize everything in kind of a big broad sweep, which worked out really well in this case.
Okay, so now it's time for us to do the analysis. And actually, I should back up. These things are all happening at the same time. Remember, you've got a lot of pots cooking at the same time. So it's not like a linear process. These are really more like phases than steps. So recall that there is a potential for a data breach in pretty much every situation we see. At the very least, every organization has employee data, and you may have other types. So if you have a breach, it can get very costly fast. If a customer PII is stolen, that's $150 per record on average that you are going to spend either in the detection, investigation, legal fees, lawsuits after the fact. And we are seeing more and more lawsuits after ransomware incidents as people are realizing that data is getting stolen. The damage caused by not investigating can be much greater. If you don't investigate, you could end up being in violation of data breach notification regulations, which exist in all 50 states. It would look really bad in a lawsuit. It could look like you were trying to sweep things under the rug. That's where we see cases like this, like Uber is another example. That's where we really see them blowing up into huge public relations crises. So you really want to handle them properly. In order to tell if you're at risk of a breach, you have to know what data you have. And you don't want to find out what data you have when the hackers leak it on the dark web. You have to maintain a data inventory ahead of time. And you want to know what laws and obligations apply to you. Otherwise, it's going to really slow you down in the response process. And just like in CPR, if things slow you down, that's when we really start to see the damage. Okay, so we've done our analysis, or we're in the process. We also need to be thinking about recovery, just another pot that's boiling on our stove. So in the recovery and restoration process, it is critical to rebuild or at least clean all of your systems. If you do not effectively clean your systems, you are going to get hit with a reinfection. Again, once the criminals have that foothold, they take advantage of it. So antivirus helps, but it's not perfect. Don't think that just cleaning a system with antivirus and putting it back online is going to help you. Matt, I know you're usually the first responder in this case, or you're in the trenches doing this. Do you want to walk us through why this is important?
Yeah, I'd love to. This becomes a very, very critical point for any kind of restoration and recovery effort. If we bring things on the network without properly securing them, or we bring them on too quickly, there are some major problems that we can run into. One of the major ones is that reinfection scenario that we're talking about. A lot of times, these kind of persistence mechanisms that adversaries will use are not things that all antivirus software can detect effectively. And we obviously get pushback from a client knowing that they want to have their network back up and going as quickly as possible. But just remember, taking the extra step here will save you a ton of trouble down the road, so it's completely worth it. We also want to make sure that we're monitoring while these things are coming back online, which is, again, why we don't want to overload the network. If something happens, if we see malicious activity, we need to be able to address that right away, pull that computer off of the network, reformat it without it being able to spread to anything else. And then we can talk about decryptors, which are a whole completely separate can of worms.
Well, in this case, they bought the decryptor, correct?
Yep, they did.
And
they purchased
it
a decryptor
perfectly, and it wasn't infected with any malware at all.
In this case, it was not, but that is not always the case. So that's another thing. We want to make sure that we test those things. We sandbox decryptors just as a general policy when we're dealing with them, because they are often encrypted with a little something extra. But again, taking that little bit of extra time means we are not being reinfected with something, so it's totally worth it.
Yeah, when the criminals give you a tool, even if you spend a lot of money on that tool, they may well use it for other purposes. So be careful.
So then we had to restore remote access to the system. Like this company needs to get back up and going. Otherwise, as we said before, they're going to go out of business. The problem that they had was a long list of custom applications that they needed to operate and just maintain their business in general that needed to be rebuilt. So the overseas contractors that they were working were largely responsible for maintaining these applications and for keeping them up and running. So we had to get those guys back in the network. So we ended up having to whitelist VPN traffic from our geo-blocked areas. So we're talking about places like Russia, China, and India. And because we were dealing with contractors from all over the world, there had to be some shift in both our monitoring hours and the organization's availability hours, because we were dealing with time zones from all over the place. We couldn't just be 9 to 5 and call it a day when that's just when the day is starting somewhere else in the world.
Yep. So remember, throughout this whole process, your response has to be fast. And things that can slow it down include communication problems, like language barrier between the teams, which I know you saw in this case, Matt.
Yep.
Also, we talked about lack of a data inventory, lack of having a documented recovery plan. I know that in this case, there were also dependency problems as well when you were trying to bring up the systems. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty significant dependency problems. How do we describe it? The right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing in a lot of these cases.
Right. And then lack of control over remote systems. So it's very important to create your response resources in advance. There's only so much you can plan for a crisis like this. A lot of it will be unexpected. Focus on making sure that you will have the information you need quickly available in a crisis. So have that inventory of data, have a current list of your legal obligations. Have technical documentation like the network map. Make sure you know how to get passwords you need to access systems. Make sure you understand any dependencies. And remember, if your whole network is encrypted, you still need to be able to access this data. So I would keep it offline, backed up someplace secure. And then have a communications plan. Think of out-of-band communications or after-hours communications, particularly if you have a global company. And then what language are you going to communicate in? Do you have a translator available? All of these things are important. All right, so let's find out the outcome of this incident. How did it turn out, Matt?
Well, after the full investigation, we came to a conclusion that, again, is becoming more the norm when it comes to these kind of remote compromises. A salesman who had been working remotely from home on his personal computer did not have adequate antivirus controls or any kind of management software from his organization available to him. He received a phishing email about 2 weeks prior to the ransomware being dropped and opened it and infected his computer. The attackers were then able to use his VPN from his personal computer to access the client's network. Once they were inside the network, they were able to establish persistence. They didn't need his VPN anymore, and they could spread out from there and infect any computer that connected into the network, plus the computers that were already connected inside of the interior. The client ended up having to pay $950,000 in ransom for the decryptor, which luckily enough for them turned out to be a good decryptor. It did work. It worked fairly fast, and it got their data back for the most part for them. But we also understood that there was a risk of a data breach. This was a ransomware crew that was famous for data exposure at this point, so we had to keep that in mind. And at the point where we were closing up the response to the case, that investigation with legal counsel was still ongoing.
So what can you do to help make sure that your response is efficient and effective? First of all, make sure you're conducting response training with your on-site IT staff, with your leadership team, and with anyone else that may be involved. And again, you're not going to be able to do a step-by-step response for a crisis. And even if you did, in the middle of a crisis, no one is going to bust out that manual and go line by line. It just doesn't happen. But you can make sure that people understand the techniques, know how to gather evidence, know how to contain damage, know who's making the right decisions, and how to communicate. A really great approach is to do tabletop exercises. I know at LMG, Matt and I do them all the time. So these are simulated cyber events. You can do them virtually, you can do them in person, but you can pick your scenarios: ransomware, business email compromise, malware, supply chain attacks. It helps to clarify roles, responsibilities, align your expectations between IT management and others, and then have fun. And that will give you a punch list of things to correct. And it's also a training exercise at the same time. At LMG, we also do technical training for first responders. We are really excited to say that this is our first month offering it on demand. So you can now take our cyber first responder class or our ransomware response class on demand at your convenience. And in these, you learn the fundamentals of response. You can reduce risk for your organization. There's hands-on labs for decrypting ransomware, sandboxing and discovering an infected decryption utility, investigating a cloud breach. And then so you get that practical hands-on experience. You also have access to the virtual lab for up to 90 days. So if you or somebody you know is interested, check them out, the ransomware class and the CFR class. To recap our trends, ransomware as a service is increasing. We're seeing double and triple extortion pretty regularly. Hackers are using commercial tools. We're seeing insurance losses increasing and therefore the cost as well. And remote response is the new norm. And then our takeaways. Threat hunting is absolutely key. Be prepared to do that in the event that you suffer a cybersecurity incident, because you've got to get rid of that threat, and antivirus software is not cutting it. Make sure you have some visibility into your remote workstations. It's much better to have that software installed ahead of time, mobile device management software, something else that will allow you to identify threats and eradicate them. That will reduce your risk. Update your response processes and keep an eye on trends and changes in legislation in particular. Create your response resources in advance. Again, what laws apply to you? What information do you have? And those technical resources that are key. And then finally, make sure you're conducting responder training, both for your IT first responders as well as your whole team, so that you can make sure everybody knows their role and knows what to do in the event of a crisis. I'm Sherri Davidoff. This is Matt Durring. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll stick around for a few minutes in case anyone has any questions.
Thank you so much, Sherri and Matt. I do have a few questions that came from our audience. Let's start with this one. What has been the most interesting or surprising case of ransomware you've seen in your line of work?
I'll let you take that one, Matt.
Oh man, that's a big question. I think the most interesting ransomware attack that I've seen, and I think we've used this as a case study for a previous presentation, but it was our double ransomware example from our law firm. The attackers had managed to get access to the network. They were able to establish their persistence to drop their ransomware. The client was able to recover from backups, but the attackers then were not completely eradicated from the network, came back in, re-ransomwared the network, and then were mad about it, so it ended up charging double the ransom for it. Got the backups that time, so that was a very interesting case.
Yeah, that sounds like it. Thank you for describing that. What tools can be used for a remote incident response?
Remote incident response is kind of an interesting animal. When we're talking about things like remote monitoring, there are some great toolkits out there. CrowdStrike Falcon is a great example, Sentinel-1, Carbon Black. All of these EDR type toolkits that offer remote agents are super useful. When we're talking about remote collection, pieces of software like the Axiom toolkit or like Response can be used to remotely collect data forensically from target workstations. So if you're not able to actually get your hands on the hard drive, you can use pieces of software like that to pull that stuff back over the internet and really save everyone a lot of time. Great pieces.
Well, don't forget, there's also proactive security tools that we can be using remotely as well. So MDM tools, which you can install not just on corporate devices, but also personal devices as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, Sherri.
Oh, that's really helpful. It kind of leads into this next question. How can I keep track of employee mobile devices that access my network?
Yeah, again, well, actually, you have a few different approaches to that. I would recommend that anything that's on your production network have a mobile device management solution installed. I think, what is it, AirWatch is a very popular one. There's some other ones. Matt, how about from the network management side of things? I know that VPNs have a lot of capabilities for screening computers that are connecting and things like that.
Yeah, a lot of commercial VPN offerings, when you install the initial agent that you need to connect in through the VPN, will run a check on, or can be configured to run a check on a computer system to make sure that there is an appropriate level of antivirus or security software pre-installed. And if it's not available on the computer, it won't allow the installation of the VPN software, and you can't actually connect into the network. Using something like that can be a really quick win to keeping completely unprotected devices off of your network. And again, you can move a little bit more into it from there, but at a very bare minimum, I would recommend that. Also, multi-factor authentication. Use multi-factor.
We're just going to make up the answer to everything.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much, Sherri and Matt. Once again, my name is Natalie Adams with LMG Security. I would like to thank everybody who attended the webinar today. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.